Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joy Murphy. I'm the Director of Learning Engagement for the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Chester Pach, who will talk to us about Duck and Cover, Eisenhower, the Cold War, and the atomic bomb. So, Dr. Pach, take it away.
Thank you. Good afternoon to those who are in the auditorium here at the Eisenhower Library and to everyone who's watching it wherever they may be. We can have the first slide, please. See the title of my talk, Duck and Cover, Eisenhower, the Cold War, and the Atomic Bomb. Maybe not the best subject for a lunchtime conversation, but I hope you'll enjoy it. We have the next slide, please. I've written and edited books about President Eisenhower. As you see on the left, there's a study of the Eisenhower presidency. It's published by the University Press of Kansas. And I used to teach at the University of Kansas, and I'm still a Jayhawk in spirit, even if I now teach at Ohio University. So I'm really happy to be back here in Kansas. Next slide, please. 1952, the American people elected an international hero as president. As you know, Dwight Eisenhower commanded the victorious Allied forces in Europe during World War II, and he went back to Europe again in 1950 as the first commander of the armed forces of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The American people respected Eisenhower, but just as important, they liked Ike. They also trusted him to provide strong leadership at a time of international peril. Next slide, please. When Eisenhower became president, American troops were involved in a hot war in Korea, a war that had dragged on for more than 2 years and had become a costly, bloody stalemate. The Eisenhower administration negotiated an end to the fighting. An armistice halted the war in Korea in July 1953. Next slide. There was no quick solution, though, to the other war the United States was fighting at the beginning of the Eisenhower presidency, the Cold War with the Soviet Union and its communist allies. Next slide. The Truman administration had adopted a strategy of containment, a worldwide effort to halt the expansion of Soviet or communist power and influence. Containment, though, was costly. More than 50,000 Americans died in the Korean War. The Marshall Plan to assist in the rebuilding of European economies during its first year alone cost over $4 billion, which was then more than 10% of the entire federal budget. We now spend a little bit more than 1% of our national budget on foreign aid. Next slide. So one of Eisenhower's first tasks as president was to review national security policy. In the eyes of many Americans, containment hadn't been working as they had hoped. Communists had taken control in China in 1949. The Soviets possessed nuclear weapons, having tested their first atomic device in August of 1949, which made them an even more dangerous threat. Containment seemed to promise nothing more than an indefinite Cold War, waged at great cost on whatever battleground the communists chose. In the early 1950s, the battlefield was Korea. Who knew where the next one would be? So this afternoon, I'd like to talk to you about how Eisenhower waged the Cold War while trying to lessen the dangers of the nuclear age. When Eisenhower became president, Americans really for the first time were facing the possibility of atomic strikes on their citizens, on their cities rather, whether they lived in New York or San Francisco or Kansas City. Eisenhower was determined to wage the Cold War vigorously, but he also was keenly aware of the dangers of the atomic age. He was concerned about the spiraling costs of national security, and he came to believe that a nuclear war was unwinnable. Eisenhower hoped to lessen the Cold War tensions and to sign a treaty with the Soviet Union that limited nuclear testing. His efforts to meet the dangers of the nuclear age were a major test of his leadership, one of the themes of these talks that you'll hear during this year. Eisenhower didn't achieve his goal of signing an agreement to limit nuclear testing, but he did have a keen understanding of ends and means, how U.S. goals in the nuclear age should always reflect American values. His efforts help us understand the difficulties and the dangers of the Cold War in the 1950s, time when Americans first learned to duck and cover. In October 1953, Eisenhower approved a national security strategy called the New Look. So what was new about the New Look? First, it emphasized security that the country could afford. During the Korean War, the defense budget had quadrupled. Even though defense spending was certain to fall after the war was over, Eisenhower still knew that the global obligations and global challenges of the Cold War would continue to be expensive. According to the New Look, a strong, healthy, and expanding U.S. economy was essential to the security and stability of the free world. But how could Eisenhower achieve that goal? One way was to rely more heavily on covert operations, secret interventions by the Central Intelligence Agency against governments that the Eisenhower administration considered hostile or threatening. During Eisenhower's presidency, the CIA helped topple governments in Iran and Guatemala. What else was new about the New Look? It placed greater reliance on nuclear weapons. Armies and navies were expensive. It costs a lot to keep 2 or 2.5 million soldiers, seamen, Marines in uniform and ready for action. It costs less to build nuclear weapons and maintain the Air Force that would deliver them to target. One of the popular phrases of the 1950s, nuclear weapons provided more bang for the buck. Under the New Look, nuclear weapons would be as available for use as other munitions. Of course, what Eisenhower hoped was that nuclear strength would deter or prevent war, that those nuclear weapons would never be used at all. We have the next slide. It's like we don't have the chart there that goes with the slide. The Air Force received the biggest share of the defense budget, while the Army share and the Navy share shrank. What that chart should show you is the number of U.S. nuclear weapons during the Eisenhower presidency. When Eisenhower entered the White House, there were about 1,000 nuclear weapons that the United States had in its arsenal. By the end of his presidency, there were 18,000. Let's have the next slide. One other important point about the New Look. Eisenhower insisted that defense was a means to an end, that the United States waged Cold War to preserve fundamental values. He worried that national security expenditures would take away from more vital, productive civilian expenditures. With rare eloquence, he delivered a speech in April 1953 in which he declared, these are his words, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed." Eisenhower framed security issues in moral terms. Security had to preserve a nation's fundamental values. And if policies aimed at winning the Cold War corrupted U.S. ideals, then the country had lost after all. That's a lesson with continuing relevance even in today's world. Yet it's also important to recognize the limits of what Eisenhower accomplished under the New Look. Next slide, please. This is a chart that shows you defense spending and its relationship to the federal budget overall. And during Eisenhower's presidency, defense spending was half the federal budget overall, although its share was declining. So defense expenditures constituted an enormous part of the federal budget. Eisenhower, by shrinking defense spending, at least during his presidency for a while after Korea, and holding it under some control, may have avoided the creation of what he called a Garrison State. That is, a state that was always preparing for war. But he contributed to the growth of a national security state, one in which defense activities were at the center of American life and government activity. During Eisenhower's presidency, Americans became keenly aware that nuclear weapons were part of the Cold War world in which they lived. Next slide. The nuclear age, of course, began in 1945 with the atomic bombings of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Those bombings produced horrific destruction. But not long after they occurred, some people thought that the atomic age could also bring astounding benefits. In the first months of peace, books, newspapers, magazines contained articles about atomic cars powered by a pellet of uranium that would have to be replaced only once a year. Maybe not a bad idea considering the price of gas these days. Next slide. Other articles discuss what they called atomic medicine that could cure dread diseases. And you may be able to see here a man rising from a wheelchair in a mushroom cloud. Perhaps this is an anticipation of radiation therapy. There are predictions of artificial atomic suns that could change the world's climate so that no baseball game will be called off on account of rain, no airplane will bypass an airport because of fog, and no city will experience winter traffic jams because of heavy snow. Maybe that's the kind of climate change we could welcome rather than dread. Next slide. Even children's toys took on a futuristic quality. For example, Kix cereal, as you can see here, offered an atomic bomb ring that supposedly allowed its wearers to see frenzied flashes of uncontrollable light caused by the released energy of atoms splitting like crazy in the sealed warhead atomic chamber of the ring. But parents, if you were worried, don't, because the rings were perfectly safe and guaranteed not to blow everything sky high. Next slide. But by the Eisenhower years, these visions of a rosy atomic future were overshadowed by dangers and fears. The United States tested the first hydrogen bomb in November 1952. The Soviets exploded their own a few months later, August 1953. Hydrogen bombs could be hundreds or even thousands of times more powerful than the weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Throughout the 1950s, the Soviets and the Americans added to their stockpiles of thermonuclear weapons. Both sides also continued to test new weapons in the atmosphere above ground and at sea, also underground as well. There was a growing concern over the dangers of that above ground testing to human beings. Next slide. Dramatic and frightening incident occurred on March 1st, 1954, a slide of a test explosion at Bikini Atoll. An American H-bomb detonated at that atoll in the Pacific Ocean. The bomb turned out to be far more powerful than expected. It was supposed to have a yield of 6 megatons, about 6 million tons of TNT, but instead it turned out to have a yield of 15 megatons, 2.5 times more powerful. Next slide. Because the explosion was so powerful, its effects went beyond the area that had been evacuated for the test. And this is a slide of a Japanese fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, that was outside the restricted zone, but still in waters that were exposed to the radiation because the blast was much bigger than expected. Next slide. By the time that the Lucky Dragon got back to Japan 2 weeks later, all the crew members were suffering symptoms of radiation exposure, including skin irritation, nausea, loss of hair. One crew member died as a result of radiation poisoning. And of course, the fish that were caught were contaminated. Next slide. Nuclear dangers worried many people in the mid-1950s. This is Winston Churchill, who was the British Prime Minister. In November 1954, he gave a speech in Parliament in which he said he feared that the cumulative effects of atomic testing could poison the atmosphere for 5,000 years. There were public warnings about fallout getting into the food chain. Some Americans, especially those in the western states, worried that winds carried fallout into their communities from atmospheric testing at the US government test range in Nevada. So anxiety about the nuclear age became part of daily life and popular culture as well during the mid and late 1950s. Most Americans, of course, still liked Ike and supported his Cold War policies. But they also knew that while the Cold War might be fought in distant battlefields, some of its perils, particularly those connected with atomic testing, could affect their daily lives. Next slide, please. US officials tried to deal with nuclear anxieties and nuclear fear in a variety of ways. Government agencies provided advice, instruction, and reassurance. You're going to see a clip of video that incorporates some examples taken from public information or civil defense films of the 1950s. The video also includes an excerpt from the film Duck and Cover, which was commissioned by the federal government and was shown to many audiences beginning in 1952. As you'll see, it offered helpful hints about what to do in the event of the atomic attack. Can we have the video, please?
A submarine bomb exploded in
Why do we have to test bombs? How little an amount of radiation will cause how many mutations?
Never before have so many known so little about a subject so big and so important.
a submarine bomb exploded in a harbor might affect a city. The affected area would be a poor picnic site, but might be entered briefly or passed through quickly with a varying degree of risk. Risk is something the military doesn't have a corner on. Occupational hazards are accepted in a matter-of-fact manner in civilian life. Risk is part of the pattern of daily routine. Some of the falsehoods circulated about radiation effects are trivial, but upsetting. They're beamed right at one's self-esteem.
And will eventually result in a race of bald-headed people. Just imagine it. Imagine yourself with no hair. They'll call you old skinhead, old chrome dome. And that's not all radioactivity will do. It will...
Enough exposure to radiation will cause loss of hair. The treatment, if you'd insist, would be symptomatic. A toupee. But the condition would only be temporary. Your hair would come back. Same color, same cowling. Which puts the finger squarely upon one of the major fallacies in the public attitude toward atomic weapons. It's the fallacy of devoting 85% of one's worrying capacity to an agent that constitutes only about 15% of an atomic bomb's destroying potential. And that's unsound. Doesn't fit.
we're going to be talking about nuclear energy and the kinds of things that could happen with an atomic emergency. And we do this not to worry you, or frighten you, but really, we've got to admit we live in an atomic age. There is an atomic bomb. So we have to be aware of this and know what to do in case an emergency happens.
If there will be a need to spend 2 weeks in a fallout shelter, we have packed our survival kit. For the food supply, pack a variety of fruits, soups, evaporated milk, vegetables, napkins.
The purpose of our demonstration today is to show you the actual preparation of one of the meals which was prepared in a modern-day cave.
Beedle-dum-dum, beedle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered.
Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Here's Tony going to his Cub Scout meeting. Tony knows the bomb can explode any time of the year, day or night. Duck and cover. Attaboy, Tony. That flash means act fast. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover.
Remember what to do, friends. Now tell me right out loud. What are you supposed to do when you see the flash?
Okay, we could go back to, here we are, for Turtle. Hope you all saw that. Tony, if you saw that atomic flash, it doesn't mean that you're doing the safe thing. It probably means you're vaporized, but we can wonder about the effectiveness of Bert the Turtle's advice. But in any case, that's what some of the things the American public saw during the 1950s. We could have the next slide, please. It's showing in the room. There we go. Eisenhower hoped that negotiations with the Soviets could lead to agreements that might limit some of the dangers of the nuclear age. Soon after Eisenhower became president, there was a major change in the leadership of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin died in March 1953. Many people hoped that the new Soviet leaders who came to power would be more interested than Stalin had been in reducing Cold War tensions. Eisenhower, however, was skeptical at first. He told Churchill, using a very sexist analogy, but I'll quote him explicitly, he said, "Russia was a woman of the streets, and whether her dress was new or just the old one patched, there was still the same whore underneath." But Eisenhower soon saw concrete evidence of change in Soviet policy, not just statements about a desire for peace. The Soviets changed their negotiating position and agreed to a peace treaty for Austria in 1955. Negotiations had been stalled since the end of World War II. Next slide. As a result, Eisenhower agreed to a summit meeting with the Soviet leadership, as well as the heads of British and French governments. That meeting took place in Geneva, Switzerland in July 1955. And it was the first Soviet-American summit conference since the end of World War II 10 years earlier. Now, Eisenhower wanted the Geneva conference to be more than just a ceremonial meeting that consisted mainly of handshakes and smiles and photographers snapping pictures. He wanted to do something dramatic that would give him the initiative, capture public attention, and serve as a basis for improved relations. He proposed something called Open Skies, That was a plan to allow the Soviets and Americans to conduct surveillance flights over each other's territory. They would use high-resolution cameras on this surveillance aircraft to gather information about each other's military capabilities. Eisenhower believed this confidence-building measure could lead to progress towards some agreement that would limit US-Soviet competition in nuclear weapons, since they'd be able to verify each other's compliance with an agreement. Next slide. Open skies was an innovative idea, but it got nowhere. Nikita Khrushchev, who was then a member of a group that ruled Russia, but soon became the sole Soviet leader, rejected open skies. He said it was nothing more than a plan to spy on the Soviet Union, and he would have nothing of it. As you may know, though, open skies, or a version of it, became a reality in 2002. Still, even though there was no new agreement about arms control or open skies in 1955, many people were hopeful because Eisenhower and the Soviet leaders had met each other and were negotiating face to face. There was a lot of hopeful talk about the spirit of Geneva. Khrushchev also spoke about peaceful coexistence with the United States. Yet to many Americans, the Soviet Union continued to pose ominous threats. The Soviets, for example, took the lead in developing powerful long-range missiles. Next slide, please. And on October 4th, 1957, they did something extraordinary. They used one of those missiles to launch the world's first artificial satellite, and that, of course, was Sputnik. And then 1 month later, they launched another bigger satellite, Sputnik 2. You'll see some video now about Sputnik 2, as well as the passenger it carried. Can we have the video, please?
Within a month, Russia was ready with Sputnik 2. This time, it carried a passenger, Laika, the dog. American public opinion was split between fear of Soviet missiles and worries about the safety of the dog they called Curly.
We can only pray in this time of aloneness and suffering for Curly that God will be merciful and speed the end. This voiceless cry of mercy as this satellite spans the earth should be long remembered as a symbol of the torture the animal world must go through. And I don't mean to be facetious at all, but something to be remembered is that there's a female up there circling Mother Earth.
If we could go back to the Sputnik slide, please. I think there may be some people in the room who do remember the launching of Sputnik. There was a powerful reaction to these satellites around the world, and especially in the United States. Yet many people were fascinated. They used binoculars and telescopes to scan the night sky and track the satellites across the heavens. They may have cheered Laika or Curly or prayed for her as she made her final mission. But they were also fearful. The Soviets had gained the lead in space technology in the space race by developing sophisticated technology, an area that was supposed to be an American strength. Next slide, please. And US efforts to launch a satellite during the fall of 1957 deepened anxieties. There were some unsettling failures. And this is a newspaper headline about one of them that occurred in December 1957, when a missile that was supposed to launch a satellite burned only 3 seconds after being fired. The United States did finally launch its first satellite in January of 1958, but still there were lingering fears. If the Soviets could launch a satellite into space, couldn't they put a nuclear warhead on one of those missiles and devastate the United States? Democrats, who were already thinking about winning the White House in 1960, charged Eisenhower with allowing the United States to fall behind in the development of long-range missiles. Next slide. Missile gap was the term they used to describe a disparity between the supposedly superior Soviet capabilities and lesser American strength. No one made the charges of missile gap more frequently than a senator from Massachusetts that we all know, John F. Kennedy. Next slide. Eisenhower knew there was no missile gap, but he couldn't disclose the source of his information. It came from an extremely sensitive source of information. Next slide, please. And that was the U-2 spy plane or reconnaissance plane. U-2 aircraft began flying over Soviet territory in mid-1956, gathering photographic evidence about missile bases or other Soviet military and space programs. The CIA was in charge of the U-2 program, and it was one of the most closely guarded secrets in government. Next slide, please. Eisenhower didn't want to do anything that compromised the secrecy of the U-2. So he insisted that the warnings of doom and danger in his public statements were wrong, but he didn't explain why he was so sure. He knew, though, that the Soviets didn't yet have an operational long-range missile that could deliver a nuclear weapon against the US target. Next slide, please. Khrushchev boasted that Soviet factories were turning out missiles like sausages. Well, that just wasn't true. But Khrushchev hoped that his exaggerations, along with real achievements like Sputnik, would lead to increased prestige and greater respect from the United States. And that was something that Khrushchev was very sensitive about. Next slide. Eisenhower remained confident of US nuclear strength, and that confidence in part accounted for his desire for a détente, that is, a lessening of tensions with the Soviet Union during the last years of his presidency. He thought that all-out nuclear war would be a catastrophe. There would be no winners. He also remained concerned about the high cost of defense. He told a news conference that any president, in his words, who failed to use the last atom of his prestige and the last atom of his energy to prevent unnecessary defense expenditures would be condemned by the American people. His main hope was that the Soviets and Americans could agree to be on nuclear tests as a first step toward curbing the arms race. The Soviets unilaterally halted their testing in March 1958. Eisenhower did the same thing for US testing in October of 1958. Eisenhower hoped that there would be a way to make these temporary halts permanent. And if it weren't possible to stop all atomic testing, he hoped to ban at least those tests in the atmosphere. By the middle of 1959, Eisenhower was ready to talk to Khrushchev directly, something the Soviet leader was willing to do as well. Eisenhower knew that dealing with Khrushchev wouldn't be easy, despite their common interests in easing Cold War tensions. Khrushchev was blunt, brusque, and unpredictable. No one could be sure what he might say at any given moment. And Khrushchev certainly lived up to his reputation when he visited the United States in September 1959, first time that a Soviet leader set foot on American soil. Khrushchev toured the United States. We can have the next slide, please. He stopped at farms in Iowa and movie sets in Hollywood before meeting Eisenhower in the nation's capital. Here's a slide of Khrushchev on the set of the movie Can-Can, starring Shirley MacLaine, among others. Next slide, please. Khrushchev professed to be shocked and offended by the dance scene in which women raise their skirts. He said, "This is what you call freedom? Freedom for the girls to show their backsides? To us, it's pornography. It's capitalism that makes the girls that way." That wasn't the end of it. When US officials canceled his scheduled visit to Disneyland because of concerns about security, he wondered aloud, do they have rocket launching pads there? When Khrushchev learned that he would meet Eisenhower at the presidential retreat at Camp David, he asked one of his aides, "What sort of camp is it? A place where they put people in some sort of quarantine?" Next slide. Well, Khrushchev was finally reassured. Camp David was not the American equivalent of the Soviet Gulag. He spent 2 days with Eisenhower at Camp David, but they reached no agreement about a test ban treaty. They did decide, though, to meet again in Paris in May 1960, along with the heads of the British and French governments, a Big Four summit. After that, Eisenhower would visit the Soviet Union. Both Eisenhower and Khrushchev believed that their meetings had created goodwill, and there was lots of talk about the spirit of Camp David. Next slide, please. But the high hopes for an arms agreement vanished suddenly on May 1st, 1960, when the Soviets shot down an American U-2 spy plane over their territory. This U-2 incident destroyed any possibility of lessening Cold War tensions during the Eisenhower presidency. Now, the downing of the U-2 was completely unexpected. The planes flew at about 60,000 feet, too high and too fast for Soviet air defenses. Even though there seemed little risk that the Soviets could bring down a U-2, Eisenhower suspended the flights in the fall of 1959 out of concern that if something went wrong, it might destroy that spirit of Camp David. In early April 1960, though, he allowed an additional U-2 flight, since the CIA believed that the Soviets were about to deploy their first operational long-range missile equipped with a nuclear warhead. That flight produced no conclusive evidence. We can have the next slide, please. The pilot of the U-2 was somebody you might recognize. He was a fellow named Bono, and he came back with the message, "I still haven't found what I'm looking for." He wasn't well known at the time, but he took that line, made it into a song lyric, and the rest, as they say, is history. Okay, history didn't exactly happen that way, but we can have fun sometimes, can't we? So if we could have the next slide, please. Eisenhower authorized the second flight, provided it occurred by May 1st. And on that day, a U-2 piloted by, yes, this is the real U-2 pilot, Francis Gary Powers, took off from a US base in Pakistan to fly over the Soviet Union and land in Norway. But the plane was shot down over the Soviet Union, the crash apparently caused by a near miss from a surface-to-air missile. The downing of the plane was a disaster on many levels. The CIA, which was in charge of the U-2 program, insisted that the plane was so fragile that if it ever crashed, it would disintegrate. But that didn't happen. In fact, the electronic instruments in the plane survived the crash. The CIA also said that the pilot would never survive the downing of a U-2 flight either. But Powers became a Soviet prisoner. Instead of using his poison pin to commit suicide, he used his parachute. All this occurred on May Day, a great holiday in the Soviet Union. In fact, Khrushchev got word of the downing of the U-2 while he stood atop the Lenin-Stalin tomb in Red Square reviewing a parade of Soviet military might. And what made it even worse was that the Eisenhower administration issued a series of false cover stories designed to avoid responsibility. Finally, though, Eisenhower had to publicly admit that he ordered the U-2 flight to protect US security. Next slide, please. Only days later, Eisenhower and Khrushchev met in Paris as scheduled in their summit conference. And there you see them with French President Charles de Gaulle and British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. Next slide, please. The Soviet leader Khrushchev launched into a tirade in which he condemned US aggression. He also said that there could be no further negotiations until he received an American apology and a guarantee that those responsible for the U-2 flights would be punished. Eisenhower had already announced that he had halted the U-2 missions, and he wasn't going to publicly humiliate himself by apologizing to Khrushchev. Next slide. So what happened? The summit collapsed after one session, and Khrushchev canceled Eisenhower's scheduled visit to the Soviet Union. Next slide. In private, Eisenhower, who you may know had a fierce temper that he controlled very well in public, called Khrushchev an SOB, but soon his anger turned to depression. There would be no test ban treaty during Eisenhower's presidency. Instead, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union worsened. Eisenhower told one aide, though, that the U-2 incident had spoiled his hopes for lessening Cold War tensions, and that, in his words, he saw nothing worthwhile to do now until the end of my presidency. Eisenhower's hopes of lessening the dangers of the Cold War and diminishing the dangers of the nuclear age were by no means unrealistic rather. They were realistic, not unrealistic. Without the U-2 incident, it's easy to imagine Eisenhower and Khrushchev signing a limited nuclear test ban treaty in 1960. That actually happened 3 years later during John F. Kennedy's presidency. So we can ask, in wrapping this up, what went wrong? I think the responsibility for this missed opportunity rests on both sides. Next slide, please. There's Khrushchev. Khrushchev was playing a risky game. By making such an issue of the U-2, he apparently hoped to silence critics in his own regime who thought he wasn't being tough enough with the West by pursuing peaceful coexistence. Maybe he also thought that he could soften up Eisenhower with his inflammatory accusations. But his eagerness to score propaganda points poisoned the international atmosphere and wrecked any hopes for a nuclear test ban treaty while Eisenhower was president. We can have the next slide, please. I guess we don't have it. No, that's not it. Oh, yeah, yes, that is. I'm sorry. I'm saying me as well. Okay. Media can be confusing sometimes. Eisenhower, too, made mistakes. He courted danger by resuming the U-2 missions just weeks before the summit with Khrushchev. He knew that was a risky move, but he believed he had a responsibility to gain any new information about Soviet military capabilities. He was unable to bring his policies fully into conformity with his genuine desire to promote peace and pursue détente. But it's important to emphasize that Eisenhower was looking for a way to lessen Cold War tensions, to find a road toward détente. This was an important measure of his leadership. Next slide, please. Despite the U-2 disaster, it seemed that the danger of nuclear war receded during Eisenhower's presidency. This is a slide of the cover of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has what's called the Doomsday Clock on its cover. It's a measure of how far we are from that nuclear midnight. When Eisenhower became president in 1953, the clock said 2 minutes to midnight. In 1960, the clock said 7 minutes to midnight. We can go to the next slide, please. So it seemed, at least the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists editors, that the danger of nuclear war receded during Eisenhower's presidency. But the perils of the Cold War and the atomic bomb were still very real at the end of Eisenhower's presidency. And the American people, as always, learned how to deal with them. Next slide. This is a photograph from Life magazine on August 10, 1959. And it shows Maria and Melvin Minninson, a newlywed couple in Miami Beach. They're about to spend their 2-week honeymoon in a fallout shelter. They had all the necessary supplies for what Life called their sheltered honeymoon. Next slide, please. The Minninsons knew, like Bert the Turtle, that the bomb could go off at any time and without warning. And if it did, this newlywed couple would be ducking and covering and probably doing something else as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Pach. At this time, we will take questions both from the audience and from online. So if you have any questions, if you have a question, you can stand up and ask your question, and I'll repeat it for the people online. Yes, stand up for me, please.
All right. Just curious, what happened to the
Granted period powers eventually was exchanged in a prisoner swap, I believe it was in 1962. He came back to the United States. As I recall, and I think I'm accurate, and surely people out there will know whether or not I am, he was a helicopter pilot and a kind of weather analyst. He was our traffic and weather sort of guy, and flew his helicopter, and I believe he died in a helicopter crash. Right. But in any case, he did come back to the United States in 1962 after serving some time in Soviet jail.
Okay, next question. Anyone?
Anyone want to know what happened to Bono?
An observation. Surgeon Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev's son, was close with his father. And it's very true. I had a conversation with him when he was over here at the Eisenhower Center, and he's upset that the U-2 incident happened, not only because it happened, but because it broke off what he thought was a developing dialogue with Eisenhower. And in later years, I mean, he shared it at that time with his son, but he really wished it hadn't happened, not just for the show of it, but because it broke off what he hoped would go forward.
Well, I think there's validation for that position, because obviously a test ban treaty did occur pretty soon after Eisenhower's presidency, during Kennedy's presidency. But Khrushchev also had to, as much as personally he may have been really upset by this dialogue being interrupted, he also had to play a certain role and protect certain interests. He had to protest. He had to act in an outraged way. And the Soviets had known about U-2 flights for a long time and had said nothing publicly, because if they had, what it would call attention to was their inability to defend their own territory. So had to bite his tongue there. So in some ways he gave in to temptation and also pressures too. But if both leaders had had their way, that dialogue would have continued. And it's unfortunate that they found themselves in a position and reacted in a way that at least postponed that opportunity for a while. But I think it's also, as I tried to point out, they were moving in the right direction. They had prepared the way for what came later.
Okay, we have a slight delay with YouTube, so that's what we're doing here. I don't know if anyone online heard me, but if you do have questions, you can put them wherever you're watching us from, whether YouTube or Facebook. Put it in the chat. I'll be happy to moderate those questions. Do we have any other questions from the audience in person? Or comments? I see a hand in the back. Yes, sir.
Was there, did you know, was there any talk of going to the moon in Eisenhower's time?
I'm not aware of any talk on a governmental level where people were saying, you know, setting a date as Kennedy did in 1961 to reach the moon by the end of the 1960s. Obviously, though, there's preparation for space travel. The Mercury astronauts were selected in 1959. And so space program has its genesis. NASA was created during Eisenhower's presidency, but there wasn't that kind of public discussion of getting to the moon by a certain date, as Kennedy made as a goal, a measure of American technological know-how, and also a desire to overcome those early apparent victories of the Soviet manned space program, with Yuri Gagarin being the first cosmonaut into space before Alan Shepard by about a month. I wonder, can I ask just a quick question of the audience? How many of you here, some of us are of a certain age group, and so we can kind of guess, you know, our vintage. How many of you remember Sputnik or any of the things I talked about. Anyone have any particular recollections you want to share, or memories of Sputnik or anything else of that early space age, or the danger of nuclear war or ducking and covering?
Yeah, I grew up outside of New York City, and I guess I was an intelligent kid because I quickly figured out that we were far enough out that we would escape the fireball, but on the other hand, probably die of the radiation. And as a child, I was very upset because my parents would not build a raid shelter. And I also, I think for a lot of us, it was a very traumatic experience because the air raid siren was the same as the fire siren. And every time there was a fire siren going off in town, I would wake up and wait, just kind of shivering in my bed until it stopped.
Thank you so much for that. Anyone else? No, is it the microphone? You moved. Yeah. I can remember my aunt saying on this until this one. What is Sputnik with? And I was probably about 7. So, I then became aware of the tensions of that between Soviet Union and the United States.
Any of you seen the movie October Sky? Yeah, which I think is very good at capturing some of that atmosphere of the time. One other thing maybe I could add just quickly, while there was above ground testing, is kind of moving away from space here for a second. In Nevada, wind currents could carry the fallout quite a distance. So in other words, it wasn't just if you lived in Utah or Arizona that you might be vulnerable. If some of that fallout got into the jet stream, it could be carried into areas in Ohio, where I now live, or also in New York. So there were some, if you will, hotspots, radiation hotspots far away from that test range that made civilians in a way vulnerable to, again, the perils of preparing for war in the nuclear age. And so it wasn't just a regional issue, but a national issue, as well as obviously an international issue too.
One other bit of trivia. At the time of the first nuclear bombs being dropped, my grandfather was the secretary of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's the one that sent the command over to drop the bombs. And he shared with me and had in all his files and everything. We really didn't know what they were going to do. All the testing they had a good idea what might happen. But they were 2 different type bombs. They didn't know what the effects should be. And they were really concerned what was going to happen when they dropped them. And it was a surprise to them to some degree, the extent of damage also.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good point. There was one test of one type of bomb. There were 2 different bombs of different types, as you point out, used against Japan at the end of the war. And so one could hope, one might expect, but one never knew. And so there's a lack of confidence until you can be sure. Testing obviously develops over time, becomes much more sophisticated, much more frequent. There are many more measures of bombs' effectiveness or lack of it. But it also becomes a kind of public life. There were some tests that were actually public, that were televised as they occurred. And so people could actually watch them. There were TV dramas about nuclear testing or the possibility of atomic warfare. And so one of the assignments I have my students doing is watching a couple of TV shows imagining an atomic attack in 1954 and 1955, what it would be like, who would survive, how much life would be disrupted. Very different than the day after, for example, the movie that probably most people are familiar with, and of course has not a Abilene connection, but a Kansas connection with Lawrence. So it's a good point about not knowing for sure how some things will work until they actually occur. It reminds me to mention the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Dean Acheson, who was Truman's Secretary of State, liked to say at times that the Joint Chiefs never knew what they would say until they actually said it.
Brought back a couple of memories for me. I grew up in the UK. My only memory was funny because my mother was extremely upset that life was sent up. So it was unfair and those terrible Russians, what they did.
Yeah.
The other thing I remember, as a high school student, he took me on a visit to a nuclear power station. And I was as close to the reactor as I am to you now. There was a piece of glass between us. That just how little people knew at the time. Pretty home to me. You never do that today. But I did have one other question for you. Can you picture the Geneva summit up there?
A picture of
one of your slides, a picture of the Geneva summit?
Yes.
I think I recognize Anthony Eden on the right.
Yes.
Do you know who the other people were?
One was Nikolai Bulganin, who was one of the Soviet leaders, and I'm not sure who the French prime minister was at that point. That's an easy thing to check, though. So Khrushchev was not in that slide. Bulganin was, but Anthony Eden was there, and of course Harold Macmillan was there in Paris in 1960.
What do you think Eisenhower thought?
Well, I think we have a record that Eisenhower didn't think that the bomb was necessary, but he wasn't at that center of decision. There were people who were commanders of ground troops who thought that the war could be won without using the atomic bomb. They weren't at the center of Truman's decision making, and Eisenhower wasn't about the atomic bomb. But it seems he had real doubts and reservations about using the atomic bomb.
All right. Thank you so much. It is time for us to wrap this up. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us online. Excuse me. Thank you for your patience with our technical difficulties. We learn something new every time we have a program. So before we go, I do want to make a few announcements about some of our upcoming programs.
Joy.
Yes.
Sorry, before we wrap, we did have a question come in online.
Oh, I apologize. We did have one more question online. Since President Eisenhower was adept in dealing with emerging technological advances of weapons in the First and Second World Wars, were the Cold War weapons beyond his understanding?
I'm kind of getting two echoes here. I'm hearing you and that maybe if I can just move away for a second, I'll come back to answer it. If I can hear you ask.
Advances of weapons in the First and Second World Wars, were the Cold War weapons beyond his understanding?
It's a good question. And of course, the Cold War weapons were different than Eisenhower was used to during World War II. Technology always evolves. Eisenhower was not a scientist, but he got good scientific advice. He created the position of presidential advisor on science and technology. So he had someone who was designated to help him understand technology to the extent it affected public policy. So I don't think there's evidence that Eisenhower didn't grasp as he needed to make policy decisions, the technology that he was dealing with. He didn't have to be a nuclear scientist, though, or have any specialization in rocket technology to understand the effect of atomic weapons and of rocket science on Cold War and on public policy. So no, I don't think we have evidence that he was in any way overwhelmed. In fact, we have good evidence he got really good scientific advice.
All right, thank you. That was our final question and comment. So we'll just go right into the announcements because okay. We also learned that there's a little delay with this as well. All right, our 2022 public programs made possible by the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeff Cope Memorial Foundation. We are eternally grateful for their support. Our next Evenings at Ease will be the second Tuesday of October. So that's October 11th at 7:00 p.m. We will welcome Emily Smith, who is a doctoral candidate at K-State Leadership Communications. And then we will have our next Lunch and Learn on October 27th. We will welcome Melissa Davis from the George C. Marshall Foundation, and she will talk about Marshall and Eisenhower, Trust and Confidence. And finally, our final book club of the year will be November 8th, where we will welcome Susan Eisenhower to talk about her book, How Ike Led. So thank you again for everyone for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Pach, for such a wonderful presentation. And you all have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Oh, and for those of you who are in person, if you could fill out a survey for me, that would be really helpful.